Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Marisa Zhang, and I am a new board member for the Work Family Research Network. I am delighted to welcome everyone to this virtual conference series event on behalf of the network's leadership team, our president, Ellen Galinsky, and executive officer, Steve Sweet. I also want to thank Steve, as well as the network's VP, Jen Hook, for helping support my organization efforts for this event. And I would also like to recognize the sponsorship of the Population Research Institute at Penn State University. Before introducing our panelists, I want to acknowledge that by joining us today, you are consenting to recording, and the recording will be posted on the network's website for those who can't join us in person today. I also want to acknowledge that events like these are made possible by the generous support of our members. And if you are not a member yet, I encourage you to check out the website to learn more about the Work Family Research Network and the benefits for membership. And we'll pop that link into the chat. Thank you very much. Finally, please look out for our next virtual conference series event coming in January, the details for which will be posted soon. I'm now very excited to introduce our panelists for today's event on effective strategies to disseminate research findings to non-academic audiences. So first, please welcome Dr. Meredith Zhang, who is an assistant professor of sociology at California State University, Los Angeles, specializing in family relationships, well-being, and sexual and gender minority experiences. Second, we have Dr. Allison Daminger, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and researches gender's role in home and work life. Third, please welcome Dr. Joanna Pepin, who is an assistant professor in sociology at the University of Toronto, studying family inequality, including resource distribution within couples. And last but not least, please welcome Dr. Krystal Wilkinson, who is an associate professor in human resource management at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK, whose work focuses on the work-life interface, women's reproductive health, and the mental health at work. Unfortunately, Dr. Qian from the University of British Columbia could not join us today on the panelist plan. So welcome, panelists, and thank you for joining us for this very important discussion that is beneficial for all researchers, but particularly early career scholars. As the landscape of knowledge mobilization continues to shift, and as we aim to enhance collaborations with non-academic partners and extend our research impact to policy, the insights from our esteemed panelists on disseminating research beyond academia are both timely and essential. So with that, I'd like to begin with some introductory remarks from you all. And so could each of you please share a brief introduction to your experience communicating research results to non-academic audiences, and perhaps a brief example of your most successful experience? And in your view, what are the biggest challenges in translating complex research findings for a broader audience, and how do you approach these? And Dr. Zhang, if it's okay, we'll start with you.
Yeah, of course. It's great to see everyone. Thank you for coming today. And of course, thank you for thinking of me when organizing this panel, Marisa. So first, my experience about communicating the research results to non-academic audience. One of my most important experience related to this is that I got selected as one of the early career fellow for the Council for Contemporary Families. So that program is really to help early career scholars to really practice and learn and practice the skills to convey our research to a broader audience. So I learned a lot from that program. And then I've also written a few briefing papers about my recent research. Also, after I've written those papers, I always share it on different platforms that I have, for example, X. Now I know that people are leaving, so I'm trying to find another outlet, and also LinkedIn. In addition, I do think broadly speaking, I enjoy trying to talk about my research to a non-academic audience. Broadly defined. What do I mean by broadly defined? It can really include our undergraduate students, especially the junior students. So one of my most recent successful experience is actually when I presented at an interdisciplinary conference at Cal State LA. So it's for the Centers for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. So it's not only faculty, it's a lot of students, even my students who have kids. We have a lot of non-conventional students show up. So long story short, like after the talk, like I asked my students' kids, teenage kids, do they understand what I'm talking about? They're like, yes, yes. And I have questions. So that's how I feel like, oh, I was successful in conveying my research findings to the audience. And I don't want to take up too much time at this point, but I think the biggest challenge that I think so far is you lose your audience interest from the get-go when you're conveying your research to them. Yep, so that's me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhang. Next, Dr. Daminger.
Yes, thanks so much, Marisa. And it's an honor to be here. I feel like I'm still very much learning these skills. And so I've got my notebook out. I'm going to take some tips from the other panelists as well. So my sort of journey trying to connect with non-academic audiences began in 2020. I was a graduate student and I was frankly a little bored during the pandemic, had extra time on my hands, only so many sourdough loaves to bake. So I started writing an occasional newsletter for friends and family where I talked about the research that I was doing and that gradually, I started enjoying it. I wanted to make it a regular part of my practice. So in 2021, I moved over to Substack and started investing in more public-facing writing. And around the same time, I started trying to pitch op-eds to a variety of outlets. And I happened to pitch a journalist at the New York Times, who I thought was an editor, but she kindly informed me that she was no longer editing, but she was covering work and family issues, and she was interested in interviewing me for a column she was writing. So really that kind of total, cold outreach turned into the best publicity I could have ever gotten for my work. And that really had a snowball effect. When you are able to land one kind of major media op-ed or interview or even quote, that opens doors, puts you on the radar of other journalists. It's how I got a book contract. So that really snowballed for me. And since then, my public-facing work has been a combination of op-eds, serving as a frequent source for journalists covering work, family, gender issues, and then continuing and investing and growing my own newsletter on Substack. I think there are a lot of challenges, but one I will highlight is especially for younger pre-tenure folks. A lot of the advice that I got early in grad school was that, don't invest too much in this until you get tenure, because you don't want to not be taken seriously as a scholar. And that never really sat well with me, given my motivations for getting into this work and wanting to connect with others. And so the way that I've kind of tried to do this is to make sure that I am doing the serious research first, right? Publishing in the best outlets I can, making sure the work that I do is as high quality as possible for academic standards. When you have that kind of goodwill built up, I think you get some leeway to also communicate your findings non-academically. And then the other thing I will do is, you can, depending on the outlet, you can include links to academic sources. My Substack, there are often footnotes, caveats and things like that. So there are ways to kind of nod to the more serious folks who might come across that stuff. Not more serious folks, but the more kind of sociologically knowledgeable folks in my case. And so trying to make sure that you are maintaining credentials in both worlds, if that's important to you, is something that I continue to work on.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure many of us are aware of your newsletter, and I'm a big fan myself. Thank you. Moving on to Dr. Pepin.
Hi, thank you for asking me to do this. This is one of my favorite topics. I would say I got my start in public sociology on Twitter and using social media. I've also done a number of blog posts or briefing reports, and that's translated into some op-eds. As Allison's already said, once you speak with one journalist, that tends to snowball, and then you get asked by lots of journalists. So I've done a lot of media quotes with different reporters on the topic of work and family issues. The question of, what's one of your most successful experiences is kind of hard to answer because it, depends on the metric. So, the most widely cited research that I've had has probably been some research I did on mothers' marital status, differences in time use, so which mothers, do more housework or childcare. And that was very successful because I was in part working with the Population Reference Bureau, who really helped get that research out to a wide audience, including, an op-ed, and they produced a video, and then subsequent, writing followed that. But I actually think that the thing I'm most proud of is that when I was a graduate student, I posted a blog on my own website in which 12 people, mostly my family, read. But then I shared that on Twitter, and I found a co-author that produced an article that when that got published, I was connected with the Council on Contemporary Families, and that subsequently got a lot of media attention. So going from a very simple graph on my own blog that no one read to a published article and news coverage was, I think, it is a bigger deal, even though it maybe wasn't as, it wouldn't have been seen as more as widely successful as some other things. The challenge, again, there's lots of challenges. I think the thing that I struggle with a lot is that you have two audiences. One is the general public who maybe knows nothing about your topic and might not even be interested in it. And the other is when you're very vulnerable because the other people who are reading this are your peers and tenured faculty and people that you are wanting to maybe impress. And so holding those two audiences at the same time can feel very vulnerable and overwhelming. There's many strategies about that. The obvious one is removing jargon will help you keep the accuracy while making it simple. But the other thing that I don't think people really realize is just how much time and it takes to get a lot of feedback from lots of people so that you can both keep the accuracy and the novelty while making your research very accessible. So just like all of our research, public sociology also requires lots and lots of iterations and feedback.
Yeah, very good points. Thank you, Joanna. And Dr. Wilkinson.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really, really pleased to be here. So just for context, I'm in the UK and we have something called the Research Excellence Framework, which there's been for the last couple of iterations of that impact. So knowledge exchange and impact has been sort of something that's explicitly encouraged. So I potentially have been given more institutional support for some of the activities than is potentially everybody is having around the world. But my research, particularly around fertility journeys, pregnancy loss in the workplace, perinatal mental health, those kind of topics. The main kind of ways that I've been engaged in knowledge exchange really is media articles, so writing articles that are appearing in, for example, the Wall Street Journal or trade press. So I'm in human resource management, so we've got quite a big thing called People Management in the UK. That's kind of a magazine that's read by lots of HR professionals, and also sort of then being on the radar for comments in pieces, as you guys have said. Done a lot of radio, podcasts. Speaking at industry conferences, but I suppose the most successful kind of things that I've done really are where I've written like a research report for employers or a HR toolkit based on the findings that then can be taken up by organisations themselves, or much more commonly has been like key organisations that are working in those spaces. So the professional body for HR, they were interested in our report, and then our research fed into their report and guidance, which obviously have much bigger audiences. I work with a lot of the major charities and campaign groups, and therefore my research findings has gone into kind of white papers that have been presented in Parliament and things like that. So I suppose, that they've got that bigger voice. So it's a case of that kind of collaboration and working with them. I suppose the biggest challenges I've found really is kind of language and like brevity, like being brief and to the point and succinct, and trying to avoid the really complex conceptual frameworks and stuff like that. And also about navigating which of the many different avenues for dissemination, which ones to prioritize, which ones are fruitful. I've spent a lot of time on podcasts that probably nobody listens to, writing things. And it just comes with time. And again, that kind of reputation very slowly building, one opportunity leads to another, I kind of second that comment.
Thank you. Very, very helpful advice already. And in fact, Krystal, I think your comments lead into the next section of questions I have, which is, really, how do you go about selecting which platforms you choose to share your research findings, which is best suited for the type of message you're trying to give? And then also knowing that when talking about social media, that research findings can amplify quickly, and sometimes there's misinterpretation. And so I'm wondering if maybe our panelists can speak to those two issues. So which platforms would you select, and how do you go about ensuring that maybe misinterpretation doesn't occur, especially on something that once you put it out there, it's really difficult to take back? So I'll open it up to our panelists if anyone wants to comment first, but maybe Meredith, we'll circle back to you.
Yeah, sure. So I think others will probably have more, I don't know what to say about which platforms yet, because for me, like, opportunities come find me. So yeah, but then in terms of misrepresentation, I've learned something very, very valuable from a webinar, actually like a small conference thing from with Dr. Stephanie Coons. And she really mentioned that, like, for every piece of research that we do, like, there are so many different findings, right? So if you just let the journalists, like, if they let them read, they'll just, like, their attention will go to a few things. But she said that you should really, like, exercise your own agency and stick to a few points that you think that is the, like, strongest point, and then of course you feel most confident with, and then you always stick to this. And yeah, so that's what I learned so far. Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Allison, do you have any comments to make on this point?
Sure. So I, similar to Meredith, I would say that a lot of the opportunities are inbound at this point, especially journalist queries. Once you're on their radar, when they're writing a story, they think of you. So that is sort of, I respond as I have the time. Op-eds those are for the big ideas that, as Joanna was mentioning, have gotten polished over time. Those are things that I've gotten a lot of feedback on. They're often tied to my core research, a recent piece that I've put out that I want to connect with other audiences. So those are the ones that take a lot of time and also a lot of work to pitch, right? Usually the first time you pitch them, it's not going to be successful. You may go through many versions. And then for me, Substack is sort of my work in progress kind of blog like format. These are for more ideas that I'm, ruminating on, want to reflect on pretty quickly. Sometimes they're less tied to my core research, but are more opportunities to, I taught this lecture today, and I think other people would find it interesting, not just my undergraduate students. So how can I translate that? And with social media, I'm not really sure whether to characterize Substack as social media or not. It's sort of an interesting intermediate. I have not really done a lot with social media. I experimented with Twitter back before it became X, but quite honestly, I found the whole apparatus quite stressful and not conducive to my mental health. So I'll just say that if social media is not your thing, there are other ways to get the word out. I think it definitely helps, but you don't need it in order to have a successful publicly engaged career.
I think that's a very important point that I would want to underscore too, because there is some anxiety around social media, and particularly your research findings ending up misinterpreted or in the wrong hands, for example. So I would echo that statement. Thank you. Joanna, do you have any points to make on these questions?
Sure. I just want to say that I think a little bit we're hedging because like a lot of the social media is very much in flux right now, given US politics. Like we were talking, right before this webinar about like, people are leaving X, formerly known as Twitter, and like trying to find a different, venue. And given that this is in a big moment of change, it's hard to make recommendations for that. But I can say broadly that, I'm not a communications person. So, if you talk to someone who's in communications, they might tell you, it's important to be on social media if you want to get, a book, because you need to then show that you have a following and an audience. Allison's right, you can do that in other ways like Substack or, op-ed. So like there's different, you can think strategically about this. But mostly what I do is do what is fun for me. So, in the early days of my academic career, there wasn't someone who was on Twitter talking about the research that I found the most interesting and compelling, or I wanted to talk about, things that were in the news media. And so I started tweeting for myself. Like it was the feed that I wished existed. Public speaking is not my most favorite thing, so I'm probably not going to like rush out to try and do a TED style talk. But other scholars are excellent at that. So making it something that is fun, I think, for yourself is actually quite important. That's also important because it changes the balance of the risk reward for yourself, right? Like it feels very risky to get your name out there and a statement out there. And it absolutely can be misinterpreted. But I would say that not only could it be, but it is going to be. Like it will be misinterpreted, and that is like you should expect that. Even with op-eds, like often you don't have control over the headline, right? Like the New York Times will write the headline for you, and you don't get a say in that. So what you can control is your own writing and your own words. So thinking ahead of time about how someone might use your findings in ways that you would be unhappy about, and like thinking critically about how you might be able to get ahead of it. And then after that, you kind of just have to let it go, which is maybe unsatisfying, but like I think also scholars who are doing this recognize that's like just a thing about getting your research out in the world.
Those are good points. I was also told one time that you can look at the comments on your op-ed, but recognizing it may not be constructive criticism that people are posting. So just to keep that in mind. Krystal, do you have comments on this section of questions?
Just some basic ones, really. So in terms of platforms, for starting off, I think LinkedIn is a really good one. So kind of building a network, you can use it to the extent that you're comfortable with. So it can be just very basic things like job updates, post when you've got a paper, and let that speak for itself, or gradually starting to connect. So I use X as well. I'm with everyone else a bit like, oh, not sure about this, but in the same way, it very much started off as I've done this paper, I've done this, and then gradually following all the accounts, not just other academics, but the campaign groups, the charities, the leading organisations, and then whenever they're talking about an issue, commenting, oh, our research supports this, whatever, and then put a link to your research. And again, if there's misinterpretation there, there's an element of kind of, in a nice way, sort of saying, oh, that wasn't actually the way we did it, or you can find out more about this, just actually signposting to the research. I also found that like institutionally there can be some help. So if you're part of a research centre, sometimes your research centre will be on social media and they can promote stuff. If you are a bit worried about backlash as well, it can be a bit of security. This is coming from your research team rather than you personally. And I've got some colleagues who research a bit kind of controversial maybe topics, or topics that they think might cause differences of opinion, and they prefer that it just it's not from their personal accounts. And the other thing is, like, if your university has like a PR team or a faculty has a press department, I always tell them about anything I'm up to, even if it doesn't obviously seem directly related. And sometimes they'll do press releases and push it out that way. So.
Yeah, that's helpful. Good resources if your university or institution does have them. Thank you.
Sorry, I just mentioned to say as well, the conversation. that's like a really encouraged and recommended outlet for people to try, because not only is it kind of a very obvious hybrid between academic writing, academic papers, and more general audiences, but you get a lot of support as well from them. They do a lot of guidance on how to structure the articles and everything like that.
Yes, absolutely. And I was gonna say and or ask about that interaction with the editor through outlets like that, like the conversation, and how that can be a helpful tool, sometimes a frustrating resource as well if they're really pushing you to go one way instead of the other. But thank you very much. And I suppose on that same note, when we're talking about public writing, and particularly for those who haven't really structured public-facing document or an op-ed, for example, are there some tips to structuring those types of documents that you would suggest that could be helpful just to get things started? Of course, the resources you've mentioned might be helpful in elaborating on the documents, but just some tips or strategies in creating those outlets, or sorry, documents for those outlets. Meredith, maybe I'll turn to you to answer that.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, tips for writing those documents. So I'm thinking about the policy brief, or like maybe it's similar to op-eds. So I think like the comments that I've gotten so far, the suggestions is like, of course, first you have you just need to pick a few key findings from your papers, right? And then actually even before that, like maybe we'll like circle back to this, is I feel like probably like not all the stories need to be told. Like not all the research are easy to share with the like public audience. Like some of the papers are probably very technical in a way that you are just improving the measurement or something like that. And then regardless of like what you do, people would not get interested. Or maybe like, of course, it's not an easy judgment call, right? Like every paper is our baby. So yeah, but then sometimes I always like do try to kind of talk about my research to my family and friends first. Like if I can get their interest, usually that's like, ooh, okay, so you're interested. So then maybe like a broader audience will be interested. And in terms of structuring the document, so you first pick your main findings, like because you don't want to distract people. Like you, even for me, like for an hour, I can only remember a few things. So just pick like a couple or a few, and then as at the beginning, like you really need to think about your hook. So the hook can be your story, or it could be something. Of course, it should be your main takeaway. But when you go in, you always like try to capture people's attention from the get-go. So what I learned is like you can, if you're writing, for example, people have been like trying to find me to talk about my research for the in June, which is the Pride Month, right? So that's when people are already thinking about it. So that would be a good time for me to introduce my research about unpaid caregiving among the sexual minority people. So that's a good time. And then usually for those research at the beginning, I really try to get engaged with my audience so that they can really think about themselves, think about their lives. So that's why even for unpaid caregiving, we're all family and work scholars. So you kind of all know what that is. But the audience would be like, what exactly are you talking about? So I start by talking about caregiving is, for example, you are reminding your older parents to take medicine, or you're taking them to the hospital, or maybe you're just buying them fruit or something like that. And people will be like, oh, I've been doing that. And then that's how you kind of get them hooked. So I think that's kind of the main thing. Yeah. So get their interest first, and then focus on only a few things. And of course, no jargon, right? Even the over the life course is a jargon for them. So yeah. Yep.
Those are very good tips, yes. And it is hard to get away from the jargon sometimes. Allison, do you have some remarks on this?
Sure. Well, first I wanted to offer a couple of resources that I found really helpful when I was learning how to write op-eds. One is called the Op-Ed Project. They do pretty regular workshops. They have them in different formats. I think I did like a couple weeks of a few hours each week. You can often, if you have any sort of professional development funding, you can get the fee covered. But that's where I learned a lot of op-ed crafting. The Scholars Strategy Network is another resource. They will provide feedback on op-ed drafts. So I've taken advantage of that, and they've helped, advise on where you might want to place a draft. Another strategy is to look at op-eds written by academics you admire and sort of reverse engineer them, and I've sometimes like printed it out and said, okay, this is the hook, right? This is the main idea. Because sometimes when you're looking at things in the abstract, it's a little bit harder to connect to research. But if you can see, okay, here's how this person did it, how could I translate that to my own findings? That can be helpful. And then I'll echo what Meredith said about, needing a timely hook. That for me is really challenging, right? I want to think that my work is just intrinsically interesting all the time, but that's not how major media outlets tend to work. So it can be very helpful to follow along with the news to whatever extent is good for you, and be thinking about what are possible tie-ins. So Meredith mentioned, holidays, right? I get a lot of inquiries around Mother's Day every year. But are there public debates, right? New legislation, things that you can use as a vehicle for communicating whatever your big idea is, sort of having those things brainstormed so that when something comes up, you can swoop in and pitch it at exactly the right moment when they're looking for coverage of that topic.
That's very helpful. And just one quick follow-up, because you had mentioned op-eds tend to take longer than other, I guess, outlets or messages on social media, for example. About how much time would you want to spend on it? Because, we are often perfectionists and we will take as much time as we are allotted to write these things. And so what give or take would you say you end up spending on some of these pieces you put out as op-eds?
That's a great question. I think if I added up the number of hours, I might be a little bit taken aback, because I do think it's these things cook for a while, and the number of hours I spend actually writing it and revising it, I don't know, maybe in the neighborhood of 10-ish hours. But then, you're going to pitch it and the outlet is going to say, well, I like this, but here are all these edits, right? So there's going to be a lot of back and forth. So what I tend to think about is you want the sort of core idea in place, and then you can change the wrapping, right, in response to timely events. So, if someone gets elected, some new piece of legislation is passed, right, you can sort of see it coming, but then the hook gets changed, right, the last paragraph gets changed, but the sort of core ideas have already been workshopped and are ready to go. And then you can just sort of, change the wrapping paper, so to speak.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Joanna, do you have any comments or tips and tricks on how to structure some of these public-facing documents?
I'm not going to reiterate the very great things that Meredith and Allison have already said, other than I just want to very much highlight and underscore that public writing is storytelling, not reporting research findings. And that's very, very hard. And that I think is very time consuming. So you're starting with a story and you are ending with a story, and your facts are kind of appearing along the way in the middle of your story. And it's the opposite of, how we are trained to write academic articles.
Very true. Very helpful. And Krystal, any comments you'd like to make on this?
Nothing really in addition. I think there was really, really comprehensive summaries there around, kind of writing op-eds and things like that, and media articles. But I suppose just in terms of broader, I've done less of that, I suppose, and more of kind of, I don't know, writing HR toolkits or a report for employers or, different things. And in that way, it's just kind of like, look for examples. So if you're wanting to engage with, with businesses, look at how, I work broadly in kind of equality, diversity and inclusion spaces. So look at how other groups like charities or think tanks or corporations would write a report. How long is it? Do they use lots of bullet points? Do they use pictures? Is it an executive summary that you really want to get the core stuff in there? With how much can you put in appendices? All of that kind of stuff, I suppose, is get examples, get feedback from other people. Really do keep it as brief as it possibly can be. So, like 6 pages, or if it's something to really try and pare stuff down. And yeah, I think the storytelling I've heard of that one a lot of the time with different things, whether it be podcasts, whether it be anything else. It's about that stories are a lot more interesting to people than kind of dry facts and figures and stuff. So.
Yes, absolutely. That's very helpful. So now I think we'll move to talking a bit about creating an impact and building a following, and particularly for early career researchers who are trying to establish those relationships with, whether it be policymakers, whether it be think tanks, journalists, any tips, strategies, or advice for that, as well as I think I'll add on to that just suggestions for cold calls from journalists, for example, right? And just any thoughts about that if you end up getting a request out of the blue, how to know whether it's a good outlet, whether you should take up that opportunity, especially if you are an early career scholar. So any comments that you might have on that? And perhaps we'll switch up the order a bit. And Joanna, perhaps I'll start with you.
Sure. Okay, so the first question is like building a public presence. Okay, the first thing I would say is, like, this is just very much overlooked, is that you need a web presence. Like, is that, I don't necessarily mean social media, but like you should have a Google Scholar page. Like, what happens if someone types in your name? Like, what do they see? Like, this sounds very basic, but that's what journalists are going to do first. And so like having and you have control over a Google Scholar page, right? Like, you can link that with your university, and like that you can have a picture and you get to say something about yourself. Like, that's you need a public presence that you can control. The second thing is that it's really beneficial to join organizations that are trying to translate research for a public audience, both as a new scholar, but I've been doing this now for a while, and I still think that's the most valuable and easy and effective way to get my research out into the world. Is somebody else already has a network of journalists. Like, Stephanie Kuntz gets requests all the time, and if she doesn't feel like the expert on that, like, she's looking to other people to respond to journalists, and will send you requests. So like figuring out who those people are is really important for your own network. And then I guess like the last thing I'll say on this is that, like, regardless of platform, like if you're on X or you join Blue Sky or Mastodon, like whatever it is, being consistent is really important, and I think that feels kind of overwhelming for people sometimes. But I don't mean like you need to be promoting your research every day, but like following this like general rule of being very kind to other people. So like, in our relationships, you want to have like this 5-to-1 rule where you say like 5 positive things to your partner and like maybe 1 like request for change. And that's a pretty good guideline for like how to interact with people, on the web. Is like you should promote or engage, 5 times with other people to every 1 time you promote your own research or article or something. People really like that. So like you can be promoting fellow sociologists' work, or psychologists, other work and family scholars' work, but also like the journalist or reporter who works for the New York Times, whose articles you love, like you should respond to them and tell them you like thought this was great. Like, people like that definitely gets people's attention. So just being kind to other people. You had a second question, but I think other folks on the panel are maybe better equipped to answer that than I am.
Sure. I like that, the 5-to-1 ratio. I'm gonna remember that. Thank you very much. Very helpful advice. Krystal, maybe I'll turn to you. And again, yeah, the question just being, how do you begin to build that relationship with some of these organizations for knowledge translation, for example? And I know you have a lot of experience with this. So any tips or strategies that you would suggest to generally, but maybe specific to early scholars as well?
I think drawing on your broader network. So if you're in a department, if you're in a research centre, and there might be more senior scholars who are quite well connected with industry bodies or charities, networks, kind of thing, ask them, or even journalists, when you've got something that you would like to get out there, ask them who would they recommend and can they introduce you. I think that's helpful. Keep letting people internally and externally know what you're working on. I think engaging with journalist requests and like professional body discussions and stuff, even when it's just signposting to other people, other academics, but also just kind of other people that, I quite often will link up kind of charities that I'm working with, or like public speakers. So there's a lot about like mental health at work campaigns and things like that when a journalist is requesting something, even if it's nothing to do with my own research. I think maintaining relationships as well. So I've had quite a few experiences where people have reached out to me about my research. Journalists, for example, have interviewed me at length, and I've signposted all over the place. These people are helpful. You must contact them. And then you see the piece come out, and you're not referenced in it at all. You're not quoted. And there's a sense there like, but just to I still engage with those when I see them and say, oh, this is a great article. It's great to see that such and such was cited. Echoes what we found in our research. So you're not kind of like burning your bridges for the future. I think that's quite helpful. Your other question about cold calls from the media, yeah, I think that's again. I have had some very last minute. Quite often we have like breakfast radio, and so it's like the day before or the evening before, and sometimes you kind of thought, which guest just fell through on this one, or it's something that's only kind of last minute that's been, and some that's very tangentially linked to my research. So I'd spoken on kind of local breakfast radio about stuff in the well-being in the workplace more broadly, and then I was asked about there was a heat wave, and it was something about like heat, the impact of adverse heat temperatures in workplaces on people, and I was kind of like, oh, really? And so you kind of think, by reading what's coming out of the Health and Safety Executive, the CIPD on these at the moment on this issue, what's their official line? I'm happy to parrot that. It's not my area of expertise, and then potentially link it. I found a way, because I do a lot of women's health in the workplace, so I was linking it a bit to our research on menopause. There could be other issues, and pregnant women. There could be some more risks for certain groups. So I suppose, just kind of thinking, how comfortable are you with straying far from what you would consider to be your area of expertise? And sometimes I think about that in terms of like the audience, and like how big a deal would it be for me if I did kind of flounder? I thought, local breakfast radio is probably going to be heard by a few people in the cars. It's not going to be a massive thing. I probably wouldn't have gone on live TV on the heat wave. So yeah.
That's good advice, and definitely, doing a bit of research, maybe parodying a bit, but that's helpful, because sometimes when you do get those cold calls, you want to be able to put your opinion out there, but it does lead to a bit of a scramble. Meredith, I'll turn to you. Do you have any tips or advice of establishing some of these relationships, creating a public presence, or any responses to what do you do when you get a cold call?
Yeah, so the cold call question, I can't answer the cold call question, but I'm like happy to like just quickly just echo like a lot of what Joanna and Krystal have said, like very nicely. It's like, just have be consistent with your public presence and be nice to people. And just one additional thing that I probably want to add is like, for early career scholars, it's hard, right? It's like we do not have that many public followings, and people are still trying to get to know us. So just don't be too anxious about, oh, I want to make an impact right away. So like it's all starts small, like you just slowly building your Twitter profiles, and then you start following other people, and then do your work. I think that's probably the most important thing. I do feel like when you publish good work, people see you. Of course, if you have an institution that you can join, like CCF, or your university already have a really great office of connecting you to the journalists. Like when I was at a postdoc at Rice, there's something like that. So that's great. If you have it, like let the opportunities find you. So don't do your work and don't be overstressed. That's my 2 cents.
That's very helpful, especially to get the work done, right? That's always good advice, especially pre-tenure. And Allison, I'll turn to you.
So I definitely want to underscore Joanna's advice to amplify others' work. I think that's a great way to build goodwill. It also puts you on other people's radar. So definitely do that. The other thing I'll say is with journalists, a lot of, or not a lot, but some of the journalists who come to me are people who I've given multiple quotes to for multiple stories over the years. And if you want to build that longer term relationship, I think it's really important to be a good source, right? And so what does that mean? That means often they're working on a tight deadline and they want a quick response. So if you can respond in a timely way and, you know, make the 15 or 20 minutes that day or the next day, that can be really helpful. Speaking clearly without jargon, right? That is a challenge for academics, but if you give them good quotes, they're more likely to come back to you. When I was just starting out doing journalist interviews, I would often ask them for some sample questions in advance so that I could prepare a little bit. I don't always do that now that I've, you know, had a little bit more practice. I'm a little more comfortable speaking on the fly, but you can ask them. They probably will deviate from that script a little bit, but I felt less anxious when I sort of knew the kind of direction they were going to take the conversation in. And that also helps with the cold calling question, where you're not really sure what angle they're going for. If you can get a sense from their questions ahead of time, you can maybe tell if this is the sort of thing that you want to stay away from or that you're happy to engage in. And, you know, when you get a cold call from a journalist, I don't do a ton of extensive research, but a basic Google, right? Especially if I have not heard of them or heard of the publication they're writing for. What have they written? You know, what kinds of topics? Do they have some sort of ideological agenda? Are you okay with that agenda? Right? It doesn't need to be a super deep dive, but, you know, don't get too excited that you've been asked, right? Do a little bit, 5-10 minutes of just making sure that this is the sort of person or outlet that you are okay being associated with. I think that can prevent a lot of heartache down the line.
Yes, that's very good advice. And I think too, recognizing when you are cold called, they're calling you because they do find you an expert, right? And so whether you're an expert on that exact topic, you know, you have knowledge to distribute. So I think that's very, very helpful advice. So the next section of questions I want to ask are about when you receive critiques or criticism based on some of the knowledge you've disseminated. So what are some of the ways researchers can prepare to handle, for example, unexpected public responses or critiques that might arise once research is shared publicly? And maybe any examples that you might have or tips that you would want to share with our audience. And so maybe we'll start again with Joanna.
I'm eager to hear what everyone else says about this, because I'm not sure that I mean, I think we, you know, get better over time about handling critique, but it's always hard. Or, you know, when things you know, are misinterpreted in ways that you are unhappy with. One of the suggestions I have is to think about thinking about this is just another opportunity to get the message out there. So like you always have the opportunity for correction, right? Like in academic research, like it's, you know, sometimes helpful when you are arguing a point and then another scholar is arguing the opposite point. Like that's good for both of your publications because you can kind of go back and forth. And that's true of public sociology as well, because it gives you another opportunity to maybe correct the record. But the other thing is just, you know, try to prevent as much as you can, like a prevention approach. And so, you know, Allison's tip already of like asking for questions in advance can help you think about ways to reduce, you know, misinterpretations of your research. But the other thing is getting better or okay with like slowing the process down when you're talking with journalists, and that's okay. So, you know, I've got some, you know, good talking points from other people about, you know, like making sure that I'm clear about like what some possible pivot responses are. So if, you know, a journalist is saying one thing, or asking you something, you can say quite simply, like, let me take a moment to think about what you're asking. Like, you don't have to respond immediately. Or you can say, you know, like, let me explain it to you this way and then correct again. Or actually what my data is showing is, X. So like just thinking ahead of time about some of the ways that you can change the direction of the conversation so that you're going back to, what Meredith said is like, you've got one point, maybe two, and you're saying that over and over again. So it's just kind of a way to help prevent the likelihood of a negative outcome.
Yes, that's very helpful. Meredith, do you have comments on this?
Yeah, so I feel like everyone, you probably have experience, even if you haven't done this before, but I feel like you have relevant experience that is addressing the responses, the comments from reviewer too, right? Basically, thank you for your comments. I really appreciate your interest, but that's not the paper that I'm studying, right? That's not the research. If you're interested, like you probably can talk to Joanna, Krystal, or Allison about it. They're experts in this, right? You were building a network, like in doing that, you're promoting others' research, and then like probably like Joanna will like give me more opportunities in the future. But yeah, we've got this. Just stick to the points, just like Joanna said, like stick to the points that you want to convey. It's a great another opportunity to really reiterate your findings. Yeah.
I like that advice. We got that. Allison, any comments you'd like to share about negative criticism and how to respond?
So I forget who said this earlier, but I think that the more public-facing work you do, the more inevitable it's going to be that you will get some. So I think, the goal should not be zero criticism or zero backlash, because that sort of means probably your ideas aren't getting out there very far. So there's a couple kinds of critique that you might get. Some of it is just trolling, right? Especially if you write about gender issues or race issues or sexuality. Like there are topics that really set a lot of people off. I think, depending on the platform, like just blocking or not engaging. I very rarely read the comments, right? So they're usually not the source of serious critiques. If you are getting, a serious critique, then I think, as Joanna said, you can use that as an opportunity to have a productive debate. If you feel like it's helpful, the critiquer is coming from a good place, and not just trying to take you down. So I think deciding whether this is sort of productive or just mean-spiritedness should shape the level of engagement that you have. I think mean-spirited stuff is better to just sort of work on developing a thick skin, resilience, all those good things. If it's more serious, then you can draw on your academic training, because as Meredith and others said, you know how to respond to serious critiques based on, your work trying to get published, your feedback from advisors. Those skills are more relevant when it's, a legitimate complaint or critique of your work.
Very true. Thank you. Krystal, any comments?
Not a huge amount to add to that, really. I think that's ignoring, not engaging. I've kind of learned that over the time that some things it is just a difference of opinion, different perspective on something, and so we'll just now try not to get drawn into stuff, particularly like when it's social media related and it's replies on things and why is it done this way. If it's been a piece that I've worked on with an institution, you can say these were the parameters by the funder, or these were the parameters by the organisation. Sometimes people, if you've got good networks, other people jump in and kind of they reply for you, and the debate is carried out on your perspective is defended by somebody else. But yeah, just kind of not trying to engage, and having some other avenue to I could let go of the steam. So somebody that you can go and talk to about how you might be feeling about about some of this, because you can question your perspective or question what you wrote, and if you just go to a valued colleague and say we got this sort of feedback, and they can help you kind of put you in perspective that it's not you, it's an inevitable part of the process. Like with reviewer too, in a journal review response, quite often I go and get a second opinion on something, and is are these valid points or is it just me?
Second opinion can be helpful in that situation. And Krystal, maybe staying with you, we're just going to go into some concluding remarks from the panelists before we turn to the audience for questions. So, Krystal, looking back on your experiences, are there any lessons or maybe one particular lesson that you'd like to share with the audience about public engagement that you wish you would have known earlier in this process? As well, if you want to add any final points that weren't addressed or communicated in the questions I've asked.
I don't know whether my strategy has been particularly effective. So I didn't, with my PhD, didn't do a huge amount of kind of thinking around this. There was a couple of kind of like blogs for kind of media outlets and things like that for my PhD. But it was more when I started on my first funded project. And I had a very, very scattergun approach, which is I literally cold called and so sending emails to anyone who I thought might be interested, you know, on all of my social media, following people, and just saying yes to everything. And it did lead to some really, you know, spending a lot of time doing things that maybe weren't always or didn't seem at the time that they were obviously going to be very useful in terms of well, they've all counted, because doing some little podcasts that nobody's ever heard of is a really safe place to do a podcast, because you know you get used to responding to questions and doing things in a relatively low impact way, and then when the podcasts become much more prominent, you know, by kind of bigger figures, you've had a bit of practice. I suppose I've done very different things. So we've thought about creative methods for disseminating our research, so like doing ethnodrama recordings that we can pitch to charities that are developing their own training materials and things like that, which I've also used in my teaching. I'm in a film randomly now, just because I responded to somebody calling out about who was interested in one of our papers around like the balanced mother ideal, and it went off in totally a different direction, and I ended up talking about my own lived experience of perinatal mental illness in a film more than any of our research. But again, it can help with kind of people knowing you. So people know me now from perinatal mental health fields who, you know, would have no interest in perinatal mental health in the workplace necessarily, but it's all, say like, all exposure is good exposure in a way. And so now I'm kind of, and I'm an ambassador for the Maternal Mental Health Alliance, largely, you know, on side. So it's I've just say yes to everything, which might not be the best strategy, but you know, it's leading some opportunities that you don't think are obviously going to be the ones that are the most beneficial can be. And yeah, you can spend sometimes quite a lot of time on something that then isn't really of any interest to anyone, or doesn't seem to be having as much of an impact. So just keep going.
I do appreciate that. It's sort of, you know, try a few things, see what sticks, right? Absolutely. Allison, can I turn to you to share perhaps one of your experiences that you've had that you wish you would have known earlier in your career, and any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
So I think the thing that I would probably go back and tell my, you know, early grad school self was that it's okay to care about engaging with the public and to invest in doing so. I think I got a lot of messaging that makes you less serious, you know, don't invest in this. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's possible to be a really good scholar and a really good communicator. It's hard to do both of those things. And both require, you know, some complementary, but some different skill sets that you have to really have the motivation to invest in. I would also say that sometimes the public facing work actually feeds the scholarship. So sometimes, you know, I use my Substack posts to reflect on things I've been reading and thinking about, and sort of say, oh, is there a research idea here, right? Or, you know, I mentioned earlier that some of my outreach to journalists ended up helping me get a book contract. So they're not necessarily as opposed as I think I thought they were back when I was first starting out.
That's very helpful. And I think too that some universities, institutions are also recognizing the benefit of more public facing academia. Joanna, any comments and final thoughts that you'd like to make on this topic?
Yeah, I just we've alluded to it a little bit, but I just want to make sure that we like say clearly that it's public engagement is risky for different people. Like the potential consequences of having your work misconstrued or like the backlash that you might face is I just want to make sure that we're acknowledging that that's different. It's like depending on what topic your your research topic is, but also your your own demographic positioning. And so that's a very personal thing that that people should consider. Your own mental health. Like we've said that a couple of times. Like and that might change over time. But I guess if I could tell my past self, or maybe even my current self, something I wish I could kind of take on board is that it's okay to talk about more things than I think. Like I tend to want to say no to kind of cold calls or media requests or just general things when it's like not about my research. And I'm not sure that that's actually helpful. I think we probably all know more than we think, and we know about our colleagues' research. And if you say no, is someone less knowledgeable than you likely to say yes? Is kind of a good way to think about it. So that doesn't mean like talking about things you don't know about, but you have expertise broader than the one research article that you're currently working on.
I think that's very good advice. And I was once told that, in Canada, a lot of the funding that we receive is taxpayer dollars, and it's sort of giving back to the public in some way, right? And so turning down those requests, in a way, you're doing a bit of disservice if they're not able to access articles that are behind firewalls, for example. So good reasons to engage more. Meredith, last but not least, any comments on lessons you've learned or final thoughts on the panel discussion?
Yeah, so final thoughts. I really want to echo what everyone has said. Like, you guys are amazing. So first, it's like really this can be very fun and useful. So I just want to add a few points. For example, if you're an international scholar, if you want to get a green card, like getting quoted at New York Times or those outlets, it's great. Oh my God, it's perfect. Like they want it to put it in your application materials. That's so useful. And also like when you're early tenure, like when you're like assistant professor, those are considered like important, like a community, not get just like service, right? So those are not in vain. And I also really feel like thinking more about like writing public facing work do make me a better scholar in the way that it really pushes me to tell a better story. So now when I work on some of my research, I'm like, does it make sense? Like, it doesn't seem super coherent. Like, because ultimately for all of us, we're work and family scholars, all of our research are very like relevant to everyone's daily life. If you can't really tell a good story from it, but unless like you're doing a very technical piece, right? Like I said earlier, a measurement or something like that. But if you can't tell a good story like to your family, then it's hard to write it in a convincing way. At least for me, for my particular topic, it's hard to write it in a convincing way for your for the reviewers. So I think like everything goes in circles. It's not in vain. Even when in the beginning, if you're not getting a lot of calls, that's fine. You're really like learning the skills and you're building your community. And yeah, that's mainly what I think. Yeah,
It's very good advice. Yeah, the public facing writing helps the academic writing. Absolutely. Thank you so much, panelists. At this time, I'd now like to turn it over to the audience. We've got about 20 minutes for a Q&A. If you'd like, please use either the raise hand function and unmute yourself to ask your question, or to feel free to put a question into the chat, and I'll do my best to monitor that as well. So I see Anna K, your hand up. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question to the panelists.
Hi, first of all, thank you for organizing this and for the insights from the panel. I really enjoyed it. Okay, so I'll just tell you I'm a third-year PhD student, so that's, why I'm asking my questions. Yeah, so first of all, I have a couple of questions, I think. I was a little surprised to hear the advice of, or I don't know if it was the advice, but like this idea of maybe when you're early in your career, don't really do any media stuff because you might not be taken seriously. So I haven't heard that before. So I guess, and I know that there was a bit of a sort of a correction there where it's like, well, maybe it is a good thing to do early on. So there's different perspectives on that. And so I think tied to that, there's the question of when have you ever done your research? Because I feel like there's always more you can do and more you can find out, and how to have confidence in your ideas. And I guess, should you be promoting work in progress? And I think I heard some of that. There's different ways of promoting work in progress. You might not write New York Times op-ed on stuff that you're just working on right now. So basically, I know these questions are not 100% coherent, but if you have any thoughts on any of those things, thank you.
Great. Anna, can I just clarify quick? So one was just different opinions about engaging in media early on in your career, and then two, promoting work in progress and maybe any tips about that. Okay, great. So do you have a specific panelist, or should we just open it up to all?
Yeah, just anybody who wants to.
Okay, great. Does anyone have any comments or responses to Anna's question?
Can I just come in on the first one? It might be context specific as well. I mean, they were mentioning pre-tenure there, so that's implicating certain national contexts. Certainly, what I've heard in the UK, with REF, Research Excellence Framework, being so prominent, and research culture being so prominent now in the REF as well, which is around developing early career scholars. People on our PhD programs were actively trying now to send the message that impact is important too, and don't just focus on your PhD. Think about networking and engaging with various stakeholders in the community that might have an interest in it, and tell them what you're doing, and turn up at conferences even if you're not presenting, and industry conferences, just to network and let people know what you're doing. Yeah, and it's not just about presenting your findings. Having a presence can be telling people what you do in the methodologies you do. So I've done quite a lot with partner organizations, like feeding into their research, so like being a critical friend on their research questions and all of this kind of stuff, and that develops a relationship, and then that they'll cite your stuff as well, because some of my research, there might be quite a focused bit in a paper on a particular issue, and that's not their whole thing. They'll reference that more specific thing, but you've kind of guided them on doing their own. So I think there's lots of different different ways that you can engage with people and develop a profile without necessarily having to wait until you've got everything and you're gonna present.
Can I jump in on this question? Mostly, I'm just going to use it as an opportunity to promote Philip Cohen's book. So my apologies. But this question of is there advice to not do public sociology when you're a junior scholar? I think a lot of that comes from, at least in the U.S., from this worry that if you're doing that, then you're going to be seen as an activist, or you're doing advocacy work rather than an objective, serious scholar. And so the reason I'll give the link to I think a chapter of Philip's book is that, just as we were talking about before, is that it's actually not really the distinction between research and being a good citizen is less distinct and opposed as we might think. And being engaged in the world is probably good for your scholarship. So I think that's the correction there. And then, again, about the thing about the work in progress, as a junior scholar, it's very easy to worry that if you, put something out there, you're going to be seen as making some kind of mistake, or it's, or someone might steal your work. These are all very common things that people worry about. But, if you put the work out there, wouldn't it be so much better to get a correction before it's published in the world? Right, or have someone tell you something that makes you think about something in a different way. Those are things that strengthen your work. And also by getting it out in the world, you're kind of telling everybody that these are the things that you're working about it, and that in some ways is protection in a different way. So all of these things have trade-offs, but I'm increasingly less convinced that they're in opposition with one another.
Yeah, I agree that I think that my own feelings on this issue have changed, as I mentioned in my concluding remarks, but I also think the culture is changing in academia, where more people are recognizing the value of this work. And so perhaps some of the advice I got, was of a more old school of thought. And I think the fear, in addition to what Joanna mentioned about, are you doing activism or are you doing scholarship, was that especially when you're starting out, your time is limited. And so my advisors were worried that, you know, if you're doing this media engagement, right, that might crowd out the time that you could be working on a publishable piece. And those trade-offs are real, right? And you need to think about what your priorities are, right? And your answer to that is going to be different depending on what your career goals are, or what your sort of social engagement goals are. But I do think it's important that, you know, as we've talked about, this stuff takes time, it takes investment, right? And so being strategic about when is the right moment to invest will probably serve your goals long term.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with what everyone has said. I feel like, well, I think, mainly I think like do however much you're comfortable with and then own it, right? Like if you're just writing an op-ed and as a graduate student, maybe like you're TAing for a class, you can use that in your class and you can like, or maybe you can test the water with your undergraduate students. So I feel like it can be fun, right? Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Anna, for your question. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, I see a question. Claire, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah. Hey, thank you all so much. This panel has been amazing. I wanted to hear more. I think Meredith was talking about this right at the end, but I would love to know about how your dissemination work has influenced your academic writing and presenting, and what lessons about science communication we can then try and take to this academic context too.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Claire. How to say that? It's like, yeah, so how do my academic, my public facing, like, or like generally speaking, like before I actually finish writing something, I always talk about it to my friends and family, or they'll just ask me, what are you working on? Some of them maybe just being polite and I'll take it very seriously. I'm like, oh, I'm working on this. And then, and then they'll be like, I feel like if like it's interesting enough to them, they will ask me a lot of follow-up questions. And then I'll be like, oh yeah, maybe that's one mechanism, right? And that's how I'm like, so I always try to practice talking about the story. I'm like, does it make sense? And usually, of course, usually I start with my partner who's not a sociologist, and he'd be like, oh, it doesn't make sense and it's too complicated. And then I'm like, oh, like, what should I do? Is there something wrong with my research? And then sometimes, usually I feel like if I can translate it in a way that I can talk to more people, then people can understand that. Usually the paper itself will make a bigger impact. Let me just make a concrete example. For example, my recent paper on caregiving and sexual minority families. So that one is like, there's some general patterns. We find that sexual minority men are a lot more likely to provide care to their family and friends with significant health limitation compared to heterosexual men, right? So that's the hook already. And then actually there's a lot more other things I can include in that paper, but many other things I don't know how to tie that in with the story. And ultimately I only need to include the finding about like the descriptive finding about who they're actually providing care for. And then that really ties more into a relationship story, because the whole time I was thinking providing care, it's about promoting care, health, right? But it's also about maintaining relationship. And that's how it helps me really be able to tell the story in a more coherent way. Does it answer your question, Claire?
Yeah, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I just really liked your point and I was curious to hear more. So if other folks have opinions too, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah.
I would echo what Meredith shared, and I think of it as like distilling, you know. The feedback I got often from my advisors in grad school was, this is 3 papers, not 1 paper, right? And so I think that is something that with public writing, with an op-ed, right, you are practicing the art of drilling down to what is the main thing, right? And then how do all of these other points support that main thing? Many of us as academics have a tendency to complicate things, which is not always for the better, right? Often when someone thinks of an article, they think about one thing, right? They remember, one sentence that summarizes the finding. And so public facing work is a really good chance to practice drilling down to, okay, what is the one thing that I want to say here?
That's very helpful. Joanna, Krystal, any comments on this question?
This did make me think of like maybe one other like strategy or helpful tip to tie in your public, engagement with your research is, because I'm doing this right now, is like when you're grant writing, which most universities have lots of people who are around to help you get grants, right? Like there are people who are very invested in getting you funding, which is a really good way to get help without saying that you're doing, public scholarship, because most grant reviewers are not experts in your field. Like maybe they're in your discipline, but probably not in your subtopic. And so if you're writing a grant proposal and it's most likely going to come back with like a lot of circles of like, this is jargon, or I don't understand this. And like that pushes you to again, think about the 1 point, or like what is really like the contribution here in language that, lay people can understand. So that's maybe a backdoor workaround to getting some good feedback, but it also sets you up to do, better research. So that's like the front end of, maybe a research pipeline or a research workflow, is thinking about funding and how you might frame this will help you produce better scholarship. And then it'll be easier at the other end as well.
I was just going to sort of a little bit off topic, but in terms of like the two-way relationship between like your research and this kind of stuff as well, is that quite often some of the like reports from employers and stuff have led me to be invited to talk about my research with an employer or with a stakeholder, might be a charity or an organisation, and then they have wanted to do a project with us, or they've agreed to be on an advisory board for a project or something like that. So I think it helps. The benefits are both.
Thank you very much. Other questions from the audience? Any at all? None? Okay. All right. Well, I still had many, but I do understand that we are getting to towards the end of our time here today. And so if there are no further questions, then I want to extend my gratitude on behalf of the network to our panelists, Dr. Meredith Zhang, Dr. Allison Daminger, and Dr. Joanna Pepin, as well as Dr. Krystal Wilkinson. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a wonderful discussion. I also want to thank you all for taking this time to attend the discussion. And once again, thank you to our members for making this session possible. If you, again, are not yet a member, please do see the link in the chat to become one and see the benefits. I see also Joanna has provided information in the chat about Philip Cohen's book on Citizen Scholar. We will be having another virtual conference series event in January, so we'll look forward to those details. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again all for joining.